Hi everyone, welcome back to our journey together through the book of Acts. Since last time, you might have read with us from Acts chapter 23 verse 23 right through to chapter 25 verse 27. Now as we jump back into our story together today, we meet Paul again, and he's found himself in some hot water with the Jewish authorities. They are not happy with him at all, and they have brought him before the Roman authorities. So as we find Paul again at the start of this passage, he is the prisoner of a Roman commander named Lysias. Now, Lysias has actually just protected Paul. He saved his life from a Jewish plot. But Lysias is in the midst of sending Paul up to that next level of Roman authority. He's sending him to a Roman governor, a governor named Felix. So he writes a letter, sends Paul off to Felix, and then Felix brings him before trial. He goes back and forth with him for a really long time. Felix keeps Paul prisoner for about 2 years. And then Felix is succeeded by a guy called Festus. And Festus has a similar judgment than Lysias does. He too just sends him the next level up the chain. And we'll read about that more in coming days. But while Festus has Paul with him, he asks him some questions, he brings him to trial, and a king comes in and they have a bit of a debate with him as well. So Paul just keeps getting sent up the chain. As Acts goes on, I will see him sent to Rome because Paul has appealed to Caesar, the highest judge, the highest Roman authority in the land. Now, there's lots going on in these passages, in this trial kind of sequence that we have in Acts here. The Jews have some interesting charges. Paul has some interesting things to say as part of his defense. But I want to just focus on one thing for us together today. And that is the judgment that the Roman authorities make on Paul. We see this a couple of times in this passage. The first one is in chapter 23, verse 29, when Lysias is writing a letter to Felix. This is what he says, among other things. Verse 29 there. I found that the accusation of the Jews, had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. The next stage up our little journey here, let me read to you from chapter 24, verse 24. This is before Felix. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about the righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Some interesting things going on for Felix there. But he's definitely afraid, probably of the Jews, of his reputation, of what it is for him to maintain power and kind of calm peace of the city in this place. He's wanting a bribe, but he also wants the favor of the Jews. He wants to keep Paul in prison as he leaves and goes to another post because he doesn't want to release Paul to them. He doesn't want to set him free. He doesn't want to declare him innocent, even though he has no reason to charge him. As we go up that next level, this is what Festus then says as he's explaining to this King Agrippa what's going on. Chapter 25, verse 24 now here. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he has done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. So Paul finds himself before a number of Roman authorities who continue to declare him innocent. They don't release him. They're afraid of the Jews. They're afraid of disturbing the peace of what a release of Paul might mean. But they find no charge against him, no reason under Roman law that Paul should be in prison, that Paul should be put to death. I wonder if that reminds you of something. It certainly does for me, and we looked at it together over Easter. As we were looking through the Gospel of John, we find Jesus in hot water with the Jews, who bring him before the Roman authorities, before Pontius Pilate. And Pilate 3 times says, I find no charge against him. He is innocent. Pilate can't find anything that Jesus has done against Roman law that means he is worthy of dying. And yet, the Jews have their way, and Pilate sends Jesus to be executed. It's kind of striking as we see that pattern here for Paul as well. That as Paul is following the way of Christ, he very literally follows the way of Christ. He is brought before authorities. He is effectively declared innocent by them, and yet he remains in prison. And as we'll see further in Acts, there's some disaster still to come, and it's likely that Paul also is executed in Rome. That's confronting, as Paul is following Christ just as we are called to follow Christ. Maybe it doesn't mean following him quite as literally as it does for Paul, but I think this passage issues a challenge for us. If we too claim to be disciples of this Jesus, the one who suffered and died, what does that mean for us? It's a convicting question. Convicting in a world where chances are for us it doesn't mean arrest and death. But what does it mean to follow this Lord, this one that we see modelled in these pages? What does discipleship mean for us? So friends, as we leave each other together today, let me invite you to continue to ponder these passages, to ponder the call that they make for discipleship, as we also follow this Jesus.